Welcome to Things You May Not Know, or actually, Things You Don't Know. I'm Dr. William Weaver, and I'm here with my excellent co host and brilliant historian, Dr. Sean Deneen.
Thank you, Dr. Weaver. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Deneen, I know you have a really special interest in this topic. We both highly value this topic for another reason. It was suggested by one of our listeners, and I just want to send out a thank you. You know who
Me
you are.
and me also.
Today, we're looking at an event that tends to get reduced to trivia or a punchline, the Whiskey Rebellion. What is that?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, in 1794, this wasn't a curiosity. It was a crisis. This was the moment when the United States had to decide whether it was a functioning nation or just a loose idea that fell apart under pressure.
Yeah, this was the first major test of federal authority under the Constitution.
And the outcome shaped everything that followed for the next 2.5 centuries.
Yeah. To understand the Whiskey Rebellion, we have to understand how fragile the United States still was in 1794.
It certainly was. The Constitution was barely 6 years old. The federal government was very weak, deeply in debt, and untested. Many Americans still distrusted any kind of centralized authority, especially authority relating to taxes that looked even vaguely like British rule.
The memory of the failed Articles of Confederation was fresh. States had acted like semi independent countries. Congress couldn't enforce laws or raise reliable revenue. And of course, that did change under the Constitution.
It did, but it took a while. And internationally, the timing could not have been worse. Europe was in complete chaos. The democratic ideals of the French Revolution had degenerated and exploded into violence. Monarchies were watching Republican experiments very closely, hoping they'd fail.
Britain still occupied forts in the Northwest. Spain controlled access to the Mississippi River. Native nations were resisting American expansion.
So when unrest erupted in western Pennsylvania, it wasn't seen as a local dispute at all. It looked like the beginning of national unraveling. And it's also worth saying plainly, folks, outside of the United Kingdom, where constitutional habits had evolved slowly over centuries, most people in the late 18th century had very few realistic political options.
For much of the world, the best that could be hoped for was some form of enlightened despotism, a strong leader who governed rationally, restrained violence, and protected property, and kept the state functioning.
The alternative, increasingly visible by the 1790s, was the kind of internecine chaos unfolding across the Channel in France. Where the revolution devoured its own children, authority collapsed, and legitimacy was rebuilt through terror rather than consent.
That was the backdrop that American leaders faced in 1794.
So when Washington confronts the rebellion, he's not choosing between kindness and cruelty. He's choosing between order with restraint or the kind of spiral that had already destroyed Republican hopes elsewhere. Alexander Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary, understood this danger very clearly.
In the Federalist Paper number 9, Alexander Hamilton warned that history showed republics were often undone by what he called the quote, the turbulence and contention of faction, ending in the absolute despotism of a single man.
If you want to learn more about the Founding Fathers' fears, check out our Electoral College podcast. But for Hamilton, weakness didn't lead to liberty, it led to collapse, followed by tyranny.
So, when he pushed for federal taxation and enforcement, it wasn't because he distrusted the people, it was because he distrusted what happened when authority dissolved.
In 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion looked exactly like the opening chapter of the story Hamilton feared most.
So, why? Why did whiskey become the flashpoint?
Because on the frontier, whiskey wasn't a luxury, it was infrastructure. Farmers distilled grain into whiskey because it was easier to transport, easier to trade, and more stable than raw crops.
It kind of functioned as currency, medicine, and income. It was used to sterilize wounds. It was also used as a painkiller, which was a century before sedation. It was also an extremely valuable product.
So let's set the stage. In 1791, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton pushed forth a federal excise tax of 2 cents per 100 gallons on distilled spirits.
From Hamilton's perspective, this made sense. The government needed revenue. The tax was legal, and compliance would prove the federal government could enforce its laws.
But on the frontier, the tax felt punitive and distant. This was a barter economy. Large eastern distillers could absorb the tax. Small western producers could not.
To many settlers, this looked like taxation without meaningful representation. Again.
The very thing that had started the revolution 20 years earlier. And that language mattered. Protesters framed resistance as a continuation of the American Revolution, not a rejection of it.
So suddenly the rebellion erupts. By 1794, resistance turned violent.
Tax collectors were harassed, threatened, beaten by armed mobs, and forced to resign. Federal authority effectively disappeared in large parts of western Pennsylvania.
Liberty poles went up, militias formed. There were calls for secession. And Dr. Deneen, what is a liberty pole?
The Liberty Pole was a propaganda device from the Revolutionary period or the protests under the Stamp Act even earlier. It's a maypole type thing with a picture of a flag or a Christian cross or some symbol basically symbolizing universal freedom.
Aha. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that for our audience.
You're very welcome. Now, this is the moment when President George Washington faced a decision no American president had faced before.
Now, Washington chose force, but carefully and with restraint.
He invoked the Militia Act and assembled nearly 13,000 troops from multiple states. He wanted to make clear this was a national project to defend the Republic.
And crucially, he made the point unmistakable. The federal government would enforce its laws.
And an important psychological step, Washington even rode west at the head of the troops himself, becoming the only sitting United States president ever to lead troops in the field.
Yeah, I can't imagine that today. Can you?
No, I can't on either side.
Yeah. So, what's very striking about this is what did not happen.
There was no major battle. The sheer presence of federal forces, let alone led by the hero of the revolution himself, caused the rebellion to collapse.
But Washington did not turn this into a purge.
Arrests were very limited. Only two men were convicted of treason, and after about a month in prison, they were both later pardoned.
This does matter. Compare this moment to revolutionary France, where dissent led to executions.
On an unheard of scale, 1794 was the so-called Reign of Terror in France. The American model that emerged, and this happens over and over again throughout our history, was enforcement paired with restraint, authority and law without terror.
And the precedent became permanent. From this point forward, the federal government's right and ability to enforce its laws was no longer theoretical. What Washington established in 1794 wasn't just a response, it was a governing pattern. Firm enforcement followed by restraint, authority asserted, then deliberately limited. That approach echoes forward from the decision to end the American Civil War without mass executions to occupations that aimed, however imperfectly, at reintegration rather than permanent subjugation.
You can see it in the American presence after the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, and most clearly in the post-war rebuilding of Japan after World War II, where former enemies were deliberately converted into allies.
Even in places like Iraq, whatever the failures, the stated aim followed the same Washingtonian logic: restore order, then hand legitimacy back. See our MacArthur versus Bremer podcast for more discussions on that topic.
That instinct to end a conflict without major bloodshed and without annihilation starts here in 1794. The Whiskey Rebellion isn't really about whiskey.
Yeah, it isn't. It's about whether a republic can survive internal disagreement without collapsing or becoming tyrannical.
It shows that legitimacy requires both strength and humility, and I would also argue with third thing, sometimes reasonable compromise.
Indeed, modern debates about federal authority, taxation, protest, and resistance all trace back to this moment.
In 1794, the United States proved it could bend without breaking. Look at our pre-Civil War secession podcast for three other times where the country almost fell apart and the statesmanship of great leaders on both sides kept it from happening.
And that survival was a choice. It was a choice. It was also founded in foundational aspects of this republic. Freedom of speech. Yes, we can disagree, even vehemently, without taking reprisals on people. We can make public our opinions without suffering debilitating reprisals from those in power. This was a deliberate thing. We could stand to learn from this today.
We certainly could. It's something we don't talk about enough. We tend to look at the unfolding of our history as if it were inevitable, and it wasn't and isn't. So many times, another choice, a wrong choice, could have led to disaster. And we need to keep that in mind today. Our opponents are not enemies. Our people of different backgrounds, races, religions, exceptionalities, orientations, political points of view are common citizens of a free society. And if we let our own fear, our own anger, our own resentments get in the way of remembering that, we lose what it means to be free.
Yes, that is true. Well, listen, this has been Things You Don't Know. We hope that you will continue to come back, listen, and make comments and suggestions. We love it. Thanks a bunch.
Please do leave a like. Please make more suggestions like this.
Bye for now.